to restore that controversial travel ban.
And just so everyone's up to speed on these fast and furious legal developments, this all started 9 days ago when President Trump signed that executive order temporarily banning all refugees plus visitors from 7 majority Muslim countries. It set off protests at the airports and a flurry of legal challenges. On Friday, a judge in Seattle issued a temporary restraining order blocking parts of the travel ban. And then just last night, the Trump administration appealed that decision and asked for that restraining order to be lifted. And then early this morning, an appeals court rejected that request.
So many questions, so many angles here. We have team coverage, and we're going to start with ABC's David Wright, who's with the president in Palm Beach, Florida. David, good morning to you.
Good morning, Dan and Paula. It was a long night for the lawyers as this drama played out in a federal appeals court overnight. At this point, the case is likely to go all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court, and it's worth noting that the legal battle over the travel ban is likely to drag out longer than the ban itself would have. Overnight, a major setback for the Trump administration. No sooner did the Department of Justice appeal its case to the Ninth Circuit, but hours later, motion denied. The Federal Appeals Court rejected the government's bid to immediately restore the travel ban. Outside Mar-a-Lago, protesters made sure they could be heard.
Let's keep moving!
Inside Mar-a-Lago, President Trump insisted he's confident he'll prevail in his bid to keep out refugees and visitors from 7 predominantly Muslim countries. All day long, he went on a tirade, attacking the Seattle judge who dared to defy him.
And my question to you is, have there been terrorist attacks in the United States by refugees or other immigrants from the 7 countries listed since 9/11?
Trump's tweets came fast and furious. The opinion of this so-called judge is ridiculous and will be overturned. Many very bad and dangerous people may be pouring into our country, a terrible decision, and the judge opens up our country to potential terrorists and others that do not have our best interests at heart. Bad people are very happy. Even as the appeals process continues, at home and abroad, the protests show no signs of letting up. Meanwhile, Trump's answer to Bill O'Reilly in an interview set to air before the Super Bowl is raising eyebrows as well.
Do you respect Putin?
I do respect him.
Do you? Why?
Well, I respect a lot of people, but that doesn't mean I'm going to get along with him.
Putin's a killer.
A lot of killers. We got a lot of killers. Why, you think our country's so innocent?
A remarkable statement from the President of the United States. This was a wide-ranging interview, unfortunately taped Friday at the White House before all of this weekend. Dan and Paula?
We're going to be talking about that Russia comment in just a second, but both sides are claiming that this immigration battle is sparking a constitutional crisis, right, David?
That's right, Paula. The administration essentially accuses the judge of violating the separation of powers, trying to usurp the president's authority. And the Democrats kind of accuse the president of the same thing, saying that he's trying to bully the judiciary and provoke a constitutional crisis. The Democrats are now threatening to make this part of the confirmation battle over Donald Trump's Supreme Court pick. So a lot more at stake than just this policy.
David Wright leading us off from Florida. David, thank you. This question of a constitutional crisis was addressed in an interview between ABC News chief anchor George Stephanopoulos and the Vice President Mike Pence.
And George asked the Vice President pointedly about his tweet referring to the judge who issued the temporary restraining order as a, quote, so-called judge.
This is a judge who was nominated by President Bush, 99-0, confirmed. How is he a so-called judge?
Well, again, there's simply no question under the Constitution and frankly under federal law that the President of the United States has the authority in the interest of national security to determine who has the right to come into this country. And we're going to challenge the judge's order on that basis because the reality is we face a dangerous enemy and the President is determined to use the authority that he has under the Constitution and under the law, but we'll work through the courts to challenge that.
But doesn't this judge have the authority to do what he did as well?
He certainly does, and that's why the administration is complying with that order as we speak.
George is with us now. George, good morning. Pence did not seem to want to go there on this so-called judge issue, but doesn't these comments have don't they undermine the judiciary in some way?
Well, that's the point that Democrats have been making, and I think that you're likely to see opponents of the president's order bring this up in court when they meet again tomorrow. But the vice president has been put in a pretty tough spot there by the president. He said, you know, the president speaks his mind. That's okay. So he basically defended what the president did. But you said he didn't like having to go there during that interview. This is going to be interesting to see what happens tomorrow when they finally have the arguments in court and we see whether or not the ban is actually going to be upheld. And as David said, the Democrats led by Chuck Schumer in the Senate are already saying this is going to impact the questioning of Judge Neil Gorsuch as he tries to become a Supreme Court justice.
Yeah, setting up quite a battle between the executive branch and judiciary. But let's go back to that comment about Russia in that interview. Trump said, quote, "We've got a lot of killers. What, you think our countryside is so innocent?" He seemed to equate Russia and the U.S. What's your take?
That's something he's done several times. Back in the campaign, I interviewed him. He did exactly the same thing, even when presented with the evidence about Putin's crackdown on the press and his opponents in Russia, which has included killing at times. So this is really something right there for the president to do that. And I have to say, a very different line from what the vice president took in my interview, where he said Russia is now on notice, that we're watching Russia very closely. So you see some dissonance there between the president's words, the vice president's words, and the administration's actions right now.
What if President Obama had said something like that? How do you think the Republicans would have reacted?
I think you could imagine they would be saying exactly what the Democrats are going to be saying right now, and saying that it's sort of unbelievable that the president is equating Russia with the United States. Remember, President Obama was criticized several times for going on a so-called apology tour for the United States, where he talked about mistakes by the United States in the past. Had he done something like that, I think you'd be seeing him getting harshly criticized.
And what about the current pace of news out of the White House? I mean, we're just dealing with an onslaught of news. How long can that be maintained? And is it in the best interest of the White House?
Well, can you believe it's only been 2 weeks? It is their strategy right now. They say they wanted to show 2 weeks of action where the president is keeping his promises. And I think a lot of his supporters will say that's exactly what he's done, but it's come with a lot of controversy as well.
George, thank you. And as always on a Sunday morning, George has a big show. He's going to have the rest of that interview with Vice President Mike Pence, and it's all coming up later this morning on This Week, right here on ABC. George, thanks again.
Guys, I saw General Flynn say Iran is on notice. What does that mean exactly?
It means we're watching.
What are we watching for?
It means there's Iran would do well to look at the calendar and realize there's a new president in the Oval Office. And Iran would do well not to test the resolve of this new president.
What would testing the resolve be?
Well, the ballistic missile tests that were done in the last week were in direct violation of UN Security Council resolutions dealing with limiting them in that regard. That's the reason why the president took the decisive action that he took to impose economic sanctions on their supply chain for their missile program. But also, let's recognize that the Houthi rebels in Yemen are fully subsidized by Iran, and the attack that the Houthis leveled using Iranian arms against a Saudi Arabian ship this last week all represent the kind of hostile and belligerent actions that are simply not going to be tolerated.
That might require military action. The president said everything's on the table.
The president said everything's on the table. But look, the Iranians got a deal from the international community that, again, the president and I and our administration think was a terrible deal. It essentially allows Iran to develop a nuclear weapon in the years ahead at a date certain. And they received hundreds of millions of dollars in cash.
But Secretary Mattis and Secretary Tillerson say we have to stand by that deal now. Is that administration policy?
Well, we're evaluating that as we speak.
But Secretary Mattis didn't say he's evaluating the deal. He said the U.S. has to stand by it. Is that administration policy?
Well, I think the president will make that decision in the days ahead, and he'll listen to all of his advisors. But make no mistake about it, the resolve of this president is such that Iran would do well to think twice about their continued hostile and belligerent actions.
Good evening, I'm Rena Ninan. They're coming back to America. People from 7 predominantly Muslim countries who had been banned from traveling here under President Trump's controversial executive order. 1 week after the rug was pulled out from under their feet, a federal judge in Seattle rolled out the nation's welcome mat again. Immigration supporters celebrated in major cities today, while the president lamented on Twitter. What is our country coming to when a judge can halt a Homeland Security travel ban and anyone, even with bad intentions, can come into the U.S.? Paula Reed has the latest.
I find that the court should and will grant the temporary restraining order.
Those words lifted President Trump's travel restrictions on people from 7 predominantly Muslim countries. The ruling came in response to a lawsuit filed by Washington State Attorney General Bob Ferguson.
The law is a powerful thing. It has the ability to hold everybody accountable to it, and that includes the President of the United States.
The judge said it was this argument from the state solicitor general that convinced him the executive order may be unconstitutional.
Our claim about refugees is primarily that it is religiously motivated discrimination, and that the order is in large part motivated by religious animus.
President Trump criticized the judge and the ruling on Twitter. The opinion of this so-called judge, which essentially takes law enforcement away from our country, is ridiculous and will be overturned. The White House argues the order is intended to protect the homeland. The Department of Justice is expected to file an emergency petition to allow the federal government to resume enforcement of travel restrictions.
This TRO is granted on a nationwide basis.
Just hours before the judge's ruling, President Trump defended the travel restrictions in a weekly address.
The executive order establishes a process to develop new vetting and mechanisms to ensure those coming into America love and support our people, that they have good intentions.
But after the judge's order, it's back to business as usual for now.
I said from the beginning, it is not the loudest voice that prevails in a courtroom. It's the Constitution. And that's what we heard from Judge Robart today.
This is just the first step in a series of decisions before the courts issue the final word on whether this travel ban is constitutional.
Interesting to see the courts check and balance the executive branch. I'm curious, though, Paula, any way of gauging whether this will be unconstitutional?
In the hearing, the judge hinted that he thinks he sees some problems, especially with how this was drafted so broadly. There were no exceptions for people who had visas because they helped